Very good. Good evening, everyone. I always say that, and there's nobody watching at that point. Excellent. So I'll let a few people join before we get started. Evening, everyone. So this evening is Fizz Week. We've got 3 different styles, broken down really into 2 different sub-styles, but we'll cover that when we get there. A Prosecco, a Method Cap Classique, and a Champagne. So when we'll get to that, we will wait for a few more people to get going before we get started. I hope everyone's had a good week. This evening I've made I had a bit of extra time, so I've made the food pairings that Indigenous Kitchen had put together. So we've got, I say made, went and found some oysters or bought some oysters, and made the Cullen Skink. So it's got one of my favourite soups, Cullen Skink. So that pairs really, really well with the Champagne and the Cap Classique. So we will come to that. Very good. So I think before we really get going, I think we can pour ourselves a glass of Prosecco. If you haven't opened it already, let's get it open. So the main difference between the 3 different wines that we are tasting this evening, always when opening, if you twist the bottle and not the cork, see that? Perfect. So I also recommended we don't use flutes and you use just regular wine glasses. That's because if we're tasting this evening and trying to look for what the wine tastes like, how it smells, what it tastes like, it's much better to have a bit of a wider open neck and a bit more surface area where the wine can breathe and let off some aromas. So while that's settling down, I'll just give you a quick background about the 2 different styles. So the Prosecco is the Castello 4357. It's the original shop of the Fabiano family. It was the number on the road. So Prosecco, compared to the other 2 wines, goes through secondary fermentation in a pressurized tank. But we'll come to that. So cheers, everyone, and hope you've had a very good week. And here's to Fizz Week. So, sparkling wine. The main reason that sparkling wine has its bubbles is the secondary fermentation that starts either in a bottle or in a pressurized tank. And as that fermentation occurs, instead of carbon dioxide escaping, it's trapped, causing the pressure and therefore the fizz. So the Prosecco goes through that secondary fermentation in tank, whereas the Cap Classique and the Champagne go through that secondary fermentation in the bottle they are sold. So the other main difference is Prosecco is made from, a very contentious issue is in 2009, the grape variety known as Prosecco was renamed Glera so that Prosecco region could be protected as a European DOC. So, Glera is a semi-aromatic grape variety. The first fermentation that it goes through will be very, very cool to retain these primary fruit aromas that we all love about Prosecco. Very fresh, very vibrant. If you stick your nose in, it's a little bit like pear drops. I'd love to hear what you're tasting along at home. If you're tasting along at home, put in the comments section. If you scroll along to the fruit emojis, you'll be able to see little fruit, and that sort of triggers your brain into thinking, oh yes, I can smell peach or pear or apple. And so just stick that in the comment section. I'd love to hear what people are tasting along at home. So Prosecco, that, as I said, that first fermentation happens at very, very cool temperatures, retains all that primary fruit, that pear, that citrus. Yeah, I see pear and apple, people tasting along, that's excellent. And then the secondary fermentation happens in a stainless steel tank, and it's sealed so that no CO2 can escape, and that creates the bubbles that we all love. And always fizz is such a great indicator of celebration. Always fun to pop a bottle. Or if you saw me earlier, it's International Sabrage Day, which where you roll a sabre up the sparkling the neck of the sparkling wine and cut the top off, including the little bit of glass at the top. So I was going to do it live outside, but I thought too risky, could end up cutting my hand, etc. And I thought better do it on a video beforehand. So before we move on, before I bring Greg in, I just want to say really happy birthday to a few people. Pete, happy birthday. I know you've got a few people doing it this evening, so thanks so much for that. And without further ado, let me introduce to you Greg Sherwood. So Greg is a Master of Wine being a qualification that is almost like doing a PhD in wine. Pretty respectable. I think there's fewer Master of Wine than there are people who have walked on the moon.
Hi, Elliot.
Is that right, Greg? How are we doing?
I think it's still true, yeah. I think they're nearing 398, I think. But I think it's still
very
true.
impressive.
Cheers. Cheers, mate. I've got a couple of glasses. I heard you were being a little bit fussy about glasses. I've got a Riedel champagne tasting glass, which was very kindly given to me by Peter Ferreira of Graham Beck.
Oh, yeah.
And then I did run back in, and actually I've got a Zolto Universal, which is universally great for tasting everything, I think. But I'm gonna try and taste both wines in both glasses and see what kind of difference we get.
Interesting,
The Riedel tastes the flute. I mean, it's almost like a big white wine glass, but it kind of tulips at the top, so it's probably going to be good for the aromatics. But what have you got, a Riedel there, or?
No, so this is the Richard Brendan Jancis Robinson glass.
Oh no! How very dare you?
Well, I have got the Zalto Universal, but I thought the one glass for the one glass for all wines would go really well. And I do quite like the pear drop shape of this that gives it it's a very similar glass to the Zalto, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I just like the kind of extra tension and linearity that the Universal gives to most wines. Sometimes you don't want it, but 99% of the time you want that. Your whites or your sparklings should have a nice freshness and focus and linearity. And I just bought a whole lot of Zolto Bordeaux. So I've been tasting from a Riedel Bordeaux, a Zolto Bordeaux, Zolto Universal, a Riedel Champagne, a lot of different wines. And it's interesting just, how they vary so much. So it's very interesting. But technology, back in the day, I didn't have all these things when I was doing my dissertation, mate. We just had probably flutes or tulips, ISO tulips.
But I just saw someone said, why aren't we tasting out of flutes? And the main answer is there's too little surface area when you pour into a flute. So the wine doesn't get enough room to breathe, and you can't experience the full potential of the wine. It's like almost trying to listen through a small hole in the wall. It sort of mutes the aromas.
I've got a bit of a funny story. I hope Nikki Croner's not watching. But when I did my dissertation, I did 2 tastings for my MW dissertation, which in 06, 07, which was Method Cap Classique production in Constantia Valley. So MCC production in South Africa would have been a topic that was just too big. And they said it was during the dissertation twilight zone. And they said, if you want to pass the dissertation, be very, very focused. So I was working at doing a week of cellar rack work at David van Niekerk at High Constantia. And he said, I didn't have a dissertation topic yet. And he said, well, what about MCC? Bubbles. You like bubbles? I said, I love bubbles. And so, yeah, that's how the Constantia thing came and the MCC. And he made one of the greatest, the Clos Andre, which is, fantastic wine, and was one of the highest scoring wines right from the start, kind of 10 years ago. So that's how I settled on the MCC topic, and it was relevant to my interest, and I knew all the people who would help me do it. Anyway, so I was doing the dissertation tasting at Crook and Sancha. Very kindly, they lent us their tasting room, and Nikki Kroner said, "Why are we tasting from the ISO flutes, ISO glasses, tulips? We should be tasting from flutes." I said, but Nicky, we're trying to pick up all the aromatics and the nuances. And I said, you can't really swirl and from a flute. And he gave me a bit of a grimace as a true kind of champagne aficionado. And I kind of said, well, we're not here just to drink. We're here to analyze the whole flight of a whole lot of MCC's blind and try and see if we could pick out basically the cooler climate Constantia ones versus a flight of other South African MCCs, top MCCs. So, so that's the kind of glassware story. But
why? So why does anyone drink out of flutes? I guess that's just a champagne tradition, then, is it? It also helps focus the mousse of a champagne. So a lot of the really top end flutes will come down to a very, very fine point, and that creates a nucleation point for the bubbles to form. I think that's really why people drink out of flutes. It shows off the bubbles in the wine much more than a flatter, rounder glass like this. So, Greg, is there any?
These glasses have I'm not sure if it's the Riedel or the Zolter, but they're supposed to have a little point at the bottom there. I think this does, a little glass bead point, which where the bubbles all kind of form.
Nucleation point. Yeah. So is there any Glera or Prosecco grown in South Africa?
I'm not 100% sure, but I was recently berated quite heavily on Twitter when I waded into a little kind of light-hearted chat by a few locals there, wine trade people, when they said Prosecco is a big challenge for MCC in South African market, the home market. And I said, no, I said, it's a different category and a different product. I said, it's apples and oranges. And they said, I said, MCC is much more premium, much more, a bottle fermented, it's a much more premium proposition, even though, differing price points. And I got really berated. They said, oh, you don't know the market, and people just want bubbles, and they want, Prosecco is going to be a massive challenge for MCC. And I said, the moment you try and start, competing against MCC, with Prosecco, I mean, it's madness. MCC has to be in a much more premium category. And it needs to be promoted as a special.
Exactly. So I think before we get on too much, I think we're talking
special wine.
We're talking about MCC before people are. A lot of people won't know at home what MCC is. So the second two wines that we're going to taste are both the traditional method. So as I said before, the first one that we tasted is the Prosecco that goes through a secondary fermentation in tank, and that allows you to retain a lot of the freshness. It doesn't end up having any bready or croissant brioche characters, which the traditional method allows you to have in spades. So Method Cap Classique, which is the second wine that we're tasting, is a traditional method sparkling wine made in South Africa. So Greg, can you explain what makes, or what are the prerequisites for MCC?
So there's actually, they're trying to, on recent kind of trend, is trying to move away from the MCC to just call it Cap Classique.
Okay.
I think it might be a little bit of a challenge for a little while, because everyone's so used to, and so many people have it on their labels written that way, but they're trying to settle on the Cap Classique, and I think it's
I see here we've got Cap Classique.
Yeah, that's got Cap Classique on it. So that's the current thinking. I mean, we would, South Africa agreed to take champagne or method champenoise or method traditional, all those EU terms, off the bottle. I think it was called the Crayfish Agreement back in 1970s.
Okay.
Or maybe a little bit later, but certainly in the kind of when Simonsuk was making their Kaapse Vonkel, the first, which was in 1971. I always thought it was 1976, but it's my birthday, 71. So they always try and use the traditional champagne varieties, bottle fermented, of course, like champagne. Secondary fermentation in the bottle, disgorged, aged on the crown cap, obviously before disgorgement, and then corked.
This is quite interesting. If you look here,
this is
This is my Sabrage attempt earlier. You saw me.
Very clean.
No, well, not really. But actually, as you say, aged under crown cap, you can see the little bits of rust on the neck here where the crown cap has. So if anyone's wondering what this secondary fermentation in bottle, how that entails, it's the base wine is made and fermented dry, and then it's added to the bottle that it is going to be fermented in and then sold in. And then a little bit of liquor de tirage is added, and that contains sugar, about 24 grams per litre of sugar, or 24 grams a litre of sugar, something like this.
Yeah,
and it adds about one and a
little
half,
bit of yeast as well.
Yeah, so a little bit of yeast, and a yeast actually that has to start a ferment, and with the alcohol already at 10%, or 10 around 10%, and also at very low pHs, which not many yeasts can obtain. And then that sugar is then fermented within the bottle, sealed with the crown cap, and hence we get bubbles. And then that takes about 6 months at around 10 or 11 degrees C, maybe a bit warmer. And then the wine is kept on its side on these lees and the yeast that were left within the bottle. And that's what gets your nice breadiness and richness that you associate with a traditional method sparkling wine.
Autolysis.
Autolysis, yeah, is the real technical term. Yeah. So
around autolysis, the better it's done, and the longer the wine sits on the fine yeast lees, and the longer it is, the finer the bubble is supposed to be. So if you think of something like Dom Perignon, always used to be, or normally used to be at least 10 years minimum on the fine lees. So when it was released, and it would possibly still taste quite young and youthful, it would always have a very fine bubble and a very fine explosive mousse in the mouth. So, and that's the longer it spends on the autolysis, the autolytic kind of state, the finer and the bubble becomes. So, do we know the disgorgement date of this, and how long?
I don't know. I tried to look it up, but I know that they've only just released the 2012 vintage now, and so they're looking at 7 years on lees, which is pretty impressive, I think. I'd love to, if anyone's tasting along at home, put in the comments section what you're tasting, because traditional method sparkling wine is a fantastically complex set of aromas, and especially the rosé, which you get a lot of different fruit components as well as your secondary winemaking components, such as brioche or croissant, but you also get a little bit of that primary fruit still. So considering this wine is 9 years old, it would have been picked 9 years ago. It's amazing that it still has that slightly freeze-dried strawberries. Greg, would you agree? A bit of peach.
Yeah, I was going to say a bit of strawberries and cream, kind of sun-dried strawberries, a little bit of kind of sun raisin cherry, kind of. There's definitely a kind of little bit of a lactic note there, a leesy lactic note.
Yeah.
Kind of strawberry ripple, kind of ice cream, it's but delicious. And I see it's obviously pure Pinot Noir, and it says 48 months on the back before aged on its lees. So, but Jacques Brouwer, even when I was still back in South Africa in the 90s, he was making some of the first great efforts of method cap classique, and was one of the first handful of guys to do it like earnestly and not just as a kind of hobby side job. The thing about it's such a slow evolving industry, as you understand. This is a 2011. I finished my dissertation only about 3-4 years from vintage of this. Yet it's so slow to evolve because it's such a process. And one of the things when I did my dissertation, which really stood out, if I remember, was in Constantia at the time. If you just think about the ratio, you could make back in 05, 06, 07, a good bottle of Chardonnay from, say, Tank Constantia or Crook Constantia or something would probably sell for about, at the time, 50, 60, 70 Rand. Yet there were people like David van Niekerk selling his Clos Andre for 250, 280, 300 rand. So if you think about the increment of profit you can make, if you can carry the cash flow, if you can and carry that wine sur lat for that amount of time, it's madness to make a Chardonnay when you could make a Blanc de Blanc and sell it for 250 when instead of 50 rand. And it literally was, when I said this to people, they were like, I mean, it's obvious, but it's kind of like you put lifting this veil of secrecy, and they're like, and then a lot of people used to, only a handful of people used to make MCC, and then more and more started doing a little bit, because they got, when you would have a function at an estate, people got tired of serving other people's MCCs. They wanted to serve their own brand and then carry on to their whites and their reds and do wine launches and parties. But a lot of people just didn't make. So everyone would serve maybe a bigger brand, a JC Leroux or a Graham Beck or something. And then eventually people said, hang on, let's just do some for our own consumption on the estate. And there it grew from there. Now almost every, well, not every, but almost every estate somewhere there makes, whether it's in the Swartland making a bit of method ancestral, or people making a bit of Chamat method, or dabbling, or making a bit of MCC just for their cellar door sales. It's a category that just continues to grow and grow and grow.
I think because if you were to have a vintage rosé from Champagne, you wouldn't struggle. You'd struggle to find one for under £20, right?
So obviously, rosés always carries that premium. To say a non-vintage rosé would be more expensive than a non-vintage normal Champagne blend of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and maybe up there with rosé premium pricing, you would get maybe some Blanc de Blancs. And then you get your vintages, which is another maybe a little step up, and then prestige cuvées. But rosés, yeah, it's always carried. This is for the money. I mean, you're looking at about 18 quid here. This is absolutely fantastic quality. It's mellow yet it's energetic. It's fresh, but it's fresh and vibrant, but it's still a bit creamy, which I really like. And you can only get that from that autolysis and that age aging in the bottle, and then even a little bit of aging, as we say, on the cork. I'm not sure. I'm not such a huge fan of aging too long in the cork. I know a lot of people like to leave them on crown cap and disgorge almost to order, which seems a nice way to get fresh, classic MCC.
So I've seen a couple of comments that say, why is rosé sparkling traditional method often more expensive? And I think it's to do with the fact that the Pinot Noir is a slightly harder grape to grow, much, therefore that's a lot of the time where the colour comes from. And it's certainly in Champagne and places where that you can't blend red wine into making a sparkling rosé, other than Pinot Noir. So I find it really interesting that the only region in Europe where you're allowed to blend red and white to make a rosé is Champagne. I believe it's illegal anywhere else in Europe.
And my memory fails me, but I think there's 6 or 7 villages in Champagne which are certified to make still Pinot Noir, which they can then blend into the wine. You can obviously get color from leaving the grapes on the skin, in the press or in tank. There are, a couple of methods, but I think the general method is blending in a little bit of Bouzy Rouge kind of Pinot Noir still wine, which seems to be the kind of famous.
Or the other way is to, because you can use it in the tirage liquor as well. Or that's another way to do it. So should we move on to Champagne? On all that, should we move on to Champagne?
Absolutely, yep.
So the Champagne that we're tasting, the René Joly Blanc de Noir, is it comes from the sub-region of Champagne called the Côte de Bar. I've almost had an explosion here. I come prepared. Not this prepared. I'm glad this is off screen because it's really been quite energetic. What's the minimum pressure in champagne? Is it 4 bar, Greg? 4 bar?
I thought it was 6 bar, same as a
6 bar. Sorry,
double
6
decker
bar. 4 bar in.
A double-decker bus tire.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive, and that certainly gave that impression, and I have it all over my notes now, so that's a good start.
Whatever your sofa.
Well, nearly. No, just all over my trousers.
With, I'm starting off in the Riedel just to give it a little. Have a little look at the Zalto.
Yeah.
See.
So mine's actually, and this is a different glass from the rosé. It's actually a little pink, which is interesting.
There is a slight little hue, yeah, kind of little. Just this is pure. This is Blanc de Noir. I didn't read the label.
So it's pure Pinot Noir. So coming from from the Côte de Bar, which is actually 200 kilometers south of Reims. So it's almost Chablis. It's a completely different climate almost. And René Joly.
For Champagne, what people just sound bites that they can remember if they don't know all these, the geography. The Monton de Reims is obviously famous for its Pinot Noir. A lot of the wines tend to be 70-80% Pinot Noir. So could be called Pinot Noir on the label, on the back labels, but sometimes they add 10-20% Chardonnay. The Vallée de la Marne going then kind of east toward towards back up to kind of Paris, where is mostly where the Pinot Meunier grows, and then down in the Côte de Blanc and the Côte de Zan, you've got your famous Chardonnay vineyards of Le Mesnil and villages like that. Yeah. And then you go down south again, you start getting back more to your Pinot Noir, in the Orbe and that.
It's very dark gold. It's gold almost. I think it's the reflection of my sofa that's making it pink. I don't know if anyone else at home is.
I don't think so. I've got a little bit of a pink hue, but Pinot Noir will give you that slight appley pink hue. You should get a bit of kind of fleshy, bit more meaty, some slight savory kind of hints. I remember in my MW final exam, they gave us on one of the flights, I think it was the paper 3 flight where they can a mixed bag. It could have been the paper 1 flight of white wines, but they gave us a Le Mesnil non-vintage Blanc de Blanc, and they gave us a Le Mesnil 1990 from Magnum, and you had to compare and contrast. and you had to discuss quality levels. I mean, incredible. And luckily I nailed it, but I'm not sure I could do it now. I'm good. I could drink them now, but you had to. The key to it was picking out that it wasn't Pinot Noir. It was Blanc de Blanc with Chardonnay. And I think, Pinot Noir, you get those more savory notes, whereas the Blanc de Blancs from Chardonnay will be more citrus driven, more linearity, more minerality, liquid minerality, that white citrus, white blossom. So it's quite nice, The Jacques Brouwer was maybe a little more obvious, kind of strawberries and cream. This is, you said,
this has got a lot more autolysis. No, it's a lot more autolysis for me. I love, and it's also a little bit older. And there's a lot of people with half bottles as well, and those half bottles are really quite developed, and you get a lot of sort of honey, like honey oats is another thing I really get.
Drop my phone now.
Oh, we lost Greg. And we nearly got in your lap there, Greg.
I'm back.
And also,
I just dropped my phone down.
So this goes 100% through malolactic fermentation, which softens off that acidity quite a lot. And 10% of the base wine is fermented in oak as well.
So there's kind of, most champagnes, generally would do mallow and would have no oak. But then, people start, everything, trying to develop the category as probably talk about the kind of the whole market now of all these kind of sparkling wines and how things have developed while we drink some of these wines. But champagne, they've kind of migrated away from the entry level.
So I'm just trying to look up the questions.
The champagne producers are more and more migrating away from the kind of battleground of supermarkets and entry level non-vintage, bog-offs and £10, and they just can't do that anymore. And people's mindset has changed where they don't. In the old, 20 years ago, people would go to Majestic and buy that de Talmont or something for like 10 quid, just because it said champagne on the label. It tasted like battery acid, but it said champagne, and that was cool for a party. But now people are not. They'll buy an MCC, they'll buy a Prosecco, they'll buy a Top Cava Reserva. That it's really, really changed, and it's amazing to see, because we just thought it would just never change. But and the French response, the Champenois response, is to migrate to higher ground, more intricate wines, more premium wines, and more using a little bit of oak. And
the richness is the difference between this and the Prosecco. It'd be really interesting if anyone's still got a bit of Prosecco in their glass to go back and see how the difference between the two, because we always talk about, is Prosecco and champagne similar? And hardly ever would you have a glass of each side by side and tasting them. So if you've got a glass of Prosecco, it'd be really interesting to hear someone's comments on going back to that Prosecco and tasting the difference. And I think you'll find that the simplicity of fruit, which of course is fantastic if it's fresh and vibrant, but compare that to the René Joly Blanc de Noir, and it's a much more complex, rich, much more in-depth, and actually quite more intense flavour. But Greg, I've just seen a couple of questions pop up quickly. The first one, before we get on to the question that's actually here, is what is Malo? Do you want to fire away with what is malolactic fermentation?
So obviously the champagne grapes are picked quite green and quite fresh. They've got a 12% alcohol. If you were picking wine, you would probably pick them at 13, 14. So the grapes have a lot of their malic acid, which is like a more appley green acid. And to round that out, they would inoculate. It's not really a fermentation, but we call it a secondary, a malolactic fermentation. They would inoculate with the Leuconostoc yeast, and it would convert that from malic acid into lactic acid, which, like milk, is a softer, rounder acid.
Exactly. So what it really means at home for everyone is if you don't like sharp acidity in your drinks or wine, the malolactic fermentation converts that real sharp, appley, Greek like Granny Smith apple into a much more softer, rounder, less harsh type of acid. So this question from Leanne: what's the difference between sparkling wine and normal wine when tasting? What should I look out for? Well, for me, the carbon dioxide that's residual in the wine adds a much more vibrant texture, but essentially that is one of the only differences, other than the autolysis that you get with traditional fermented wine. Is that about,
I think also that there's so many styles that are being embraced now, from Cava to Prosecco to MCC to and traditional champagne, and they're not just celebration wines anymore. They're wines for all occasions. So I think if I was sitting on the piazza in Siena, and I'd probably want to drink a nice premium Prosecco, and I wouldn't want to drink a glass of champagne. Probably maybe a Franciacorta from up north in Italy at its stretch, but these things taste better when you drink them in situ. And the great growth of Prosecco, it grew from the great migration of tourists from Spain to Tuscany in Italy, and that people drink them there and bring back these fond memories. And it's kind of, and it catches fire and it just takes off. So I think these are wines for all occasions. So definitely, different styles for different moments, different foods, and they're all great food wines as well because they've got good acidity.
I've just seen a couple of comments from Bubbles Ferreira. Two really good comments. The first is the ripeness that they obtain in South Africa with the increased sunshine hours, etc. It softens that acidity during the ripening of the grapes, so they don't need to go through malolactic. And the other great comment he's made is sparkling wine uses all your senses. You can hear it in your glass, whereas still wine you can't hear, and that's the only sense that's missing in the still wine enjoyment. I love that. That's great.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, of course, people who don't know, Peter Ferreira, or Peter as Bubbles as we call him, is probably one of the greatest sparkling winemakers in South Africa. Been heading up the operations at Graham Beck for a very long time, and certainly if you look at his wines he makes, like things like Cuvée Clive, which sits around at £45 or something, it's probably a wine that's better than most champagnes. So a real proponent of the game, as I suppose we would have to mention Paul Gerber, who was at Lelude and now at Colmont, who moved recently to Colmont, and will be putting his imprint onto the wines there. So those two individuals, they're obsessive about champagne, and you can see the results in their products. So Graham Beck is a big brand. It sells a lot of wine. It's a market leader, but it's a real quality market leader, and it kind of opens doors to allow the other products to come through. And as I say, my philosophy is make the pie bigger, and then everyone can eat more pie. So that's the way to go. Exactly. 34 Cap-Classique.
So at what temperature should you serve champagne? 8 or 9 degrees, do we think? Somewhere around there?
I think cold, and then if it needs to warm up a bit, let it warm up. If it's, I think if you're putting it in a bigger glass, from a flute, you want it probably quite cold. If you've got something a bit more with more age, more autolysis, or if it's even been aged on the cork, vintage, or something that's had a bit of oak on, or something a bit more interesting, I'd certainly try and use a bigger glass and let it warm up a little bit, and you'll start getting a lot more complex aromatics and volatile aromas kind of coming off.
I've just spotted another great question: is why would you say the René Joly smells like marzipan? And that's a function of age. I think, Greg, a lot of people have half bottles which are developed quite nicely, and so you end up with this fantastic nuttiness that is a developed champagne. I think a lot of champagne is drunk too young, and it's a wine that can really age fantastically well.
So if you're talking about white wine, you'd be like, oh, it's a bit prematurely aged. It's like, well, no, I'm jealous. I'd rather have, I've got a bottle here. I'd rather have a half bottle. I want that brioche. I want that development, that extra honey and complexity. Yeah. That's what you want on these wines. As you say, we drink them way too young, and just because people can't wait. And they say that, obviously the best vessel size is a magnum because of but then you would have to age it as also an appropriate amount of time. But it's the best size that will keep it fresh for, the optimal amount of time if you're aging wines in your cellar. And obviously some big bottles, maybe, but certainly for purposes like this, I'm sure they're getting a lot more kind of brioche and honey and blossom and kind of some little bit of kind of savory notes, which is great. That's what you want on a good champagne. So.
Oh, I don't know if I've lost Greg or we've all lost Greg.
You got me? I've got you.
No, sorry, you just cut out for a bit. I think it's just me. I've just seen another great comment which we haven't mentioned so René Joly is a grower's champagne, which means he only uses 100% fruit from his own estate, which might sound kind of obvious to people, but in champagne that's not necessarily the case, is it, Greg? It's a lot of people buy in fruit and actually base wine often as well.
Absolutely. There are big brands. I don't think it's banned anymore, but there were big brands who were buying Sturlat, so basically clean skin bottles from growers around here and there, and just sticking their brand label on it and then making a brand. And I don't think the French OIV and all the people, they were very keen on all that. But But grower champagne. Oh, sorry, the point I want to make is grower. I've been back in the UK 20 years, and say it's only been in the last maybe 7, 8, 10 years, maybe less, 5 years, that grower champagne has just exploded. In the old days, people only wanted Grand Marques, they only wanted the brands, they wanted it at the best price. They'd shop around, they'd go for discounts, sales. They wanted Verve, they wanted Moet, they wanted, just the big names, Laurent Perrier, this, that. It was impossible to sell grower champagne other than to your private clients who had it and drank it and who fell in love with the wines and realized, it was always offered much cheaper and much higher quality. And now that has all changed. People have fallen head over heels in love with great grower champagne. And now they're like in the old days where people said, I'm a Verve man, or I'm a Moet man, or I'm a Roederer man. People have adopted, they have a real adoption of brands that kind of resonates with them. And that's what's happening with grower champagnes now. So they have their preferred styles. And then it extends from there. The French will have their preferred summer champagne and their preferred winter champagne. So it'll be lots of Blanc de Blancs and fresh, vibrant wines in the summer, and some more heavier Pinot Noir, Blanc de Noirs like your one, with a bit of age maybe in the winter. So, but a wine for all occasions.
So just okay, but take a couple more questions. What's the difference between Blanc de Blanc and Blanc de Noir? So Blanc de Blanc is really the three main grape varieties that are grown in Champagne are Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. And Blanc de Blanc means it will be 100% Chardonnay. So Chardonnay is being a white grape, Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier being a black skin grape variety. So Blanc de Blanc is 100% from Chardonnay, and Blanc de Noir is normally 100% Pinot Noir, maybe a bit of Pinot Meunier, but most Blanc. Yeah, normally could be a little bit of Pinot Meunier, which gives you a very, very bright, crunchy red fruit component, whereas Pinot Noir is a little bit more savoury, a bit deeper. But yeah, a lot of the Pinot, the Blanc de Noirs will be a bit more savoury and richer, whereas Blanc de Blanc often tends to be quite racy. I find Blanc de Blanc a little bit austere for my taste. It's a little bit high in acidity often.
So that leads it was one of the points I wanted to leave with your listeners is that obviously one of the great tricks of buying champagne is if you want your wines to taste like much more expensive premium wines, is to buy a good non-vintage, stick it in your cellar for 5 years, and then drink it. And that was, so you would buy like a non-vintage Verve or a Roederer or something, or Paul Roger, and just stick it in your cellar for 5 years. And when you pull it out, it'll taste like a vintage. I mean, that was the general rule of thumb. But, there are ways to kind of circumvent, I think, as you say, we drink them all too young. But if you think the Pinot Noirs and will be more savory kind of depth, Blanc de Blancs need time. They need a bit more time. They are that racy, steely, and that's why people say, "Oh, I don't really get it. I don't get them." But when you give them chance to get a bit more bottle development in your cellar, Blanc de Blancs are hard to beat. They're just so incredible, and they get a lot of the familiar flavors that we get on still, great Chardonnays or Burgundies with age. You get a lot of those kind of complex characters with a great Chardonnay, Blanc de Blanc. But you need to keep them. It's a classic.
Very good. Thanks, Greg. I think we've covered most things. It's been a real pleasure tasting with you. And for those who don't know, Greg and I worked together about 10 years ago. I followed him around to tastings all over the wine trade, cutting my teeth. It's my first job in the wine trade, really. He taught me so much about everything, really, but a little bit about wine.
I probably didn't. You played rugby, so you probably learned to drink before that. But I taught you how to drink fine wine. Maybe we went to some great tastings, and you were a very avid, attentive student, I'll have to say.
Glass polisher.
I can't believe it was 10
you want to say glass,
like 2-3 years ago.
It literally seems like yesterday.
Absolutely.
Oh, the last question, I see. What shirt are you wearing, Greg? I know you want to say, but someone said, "What footy shirt are you wearing?"
Okay, so we've got This is London Welsh, where I coach and my younger son plays. This is their last. They were in the Premiership for, I think, 2 seasons. They went up, they went down, they went up, they went down, and then they went bankrupt. So this is their last Aviva Premiership shirt. And yeah, no,
it can't all last. It can't last forever.
Nostalgic to wear, but it also hurts a bit. But
let's just say London Welsh didn't age as well as Champagne could.
Well, they've been promoted, so that they're only 2 or 3. They're in national
2 or 3 leagues
now.
below
they're
Dorking, something like that.
2-3 levels below championship. So watch this space, mate.
Very good. Thank you so much, mate.
Thanks,
and
Elliot.
It's been great to see you. I'm sure I can't wait to be back on your deck for a good tasting of Tondonia Rosé.
Bit of deck party. Bring it to the deck party. It's coming to.
Don't worry. I've got my dark rosé ready for you.
that when we talk about door prizes, that'll get you in, mate. That'll get you in.
Yeah.
That'll
Very
earn
good.
you an invite.
Thank you so much, mate. See you soon.
Cheers, Elliot.
Bye.